Hello again, we're back for Lesson 10 for New Testament Survey. Today we're going to be doing an overview of the history of the New Testament. So last week we introduced the concept of Biblical Theology and how we're going to be tracing themes through Scripture as well as through different time periods. And we're going to pick up our study of Biblical Theology next week, but for this week we're going to focus on some of the history that we need to understand before we can do proper Biblical Theology. So again, in this lecture, we're going to walk through briefly the timeline of the New Testament. Now, you have a lot more information on your handout for this lesson than I'm going to cover in the lecture video because of time and also because I'm mostly planning on hitting the high points. So you can read through your handout, you can put all those individual events together. I'm going to give you a large overview in the presentation, and hopefully it will help you to better place those events in the New Testament. So again, what we're doing in this lesson is building a New Testament chronology. What are we going to talk about specifically? The topics are the life of Jesus, Acts and Paul, the rest of the New Testament books, and then putting it all together. I want to start with the life of Jesus. Now, your handout doesn't discuss this, and quite frankly, there's not a lot to discuss. I kind of just want to give you the background before we talk about the rest of the New Testament. So Christ is born sometime around 6 BC, about 6 years before the turn of the millennium. At around 7 BC, Jesus is 12 years old. We have the story of him getting lost and then learning in the temple with the elders. He begins his public ministry around 26-27 AD, and then his death, burial, and resurrection all happen in 30 AD. It's interesting, and this goes back to our discussion of the Gospels as Greco-Roman biographies. Only Luke talks about the event of Christ learning in the temple. Only Luke and Matthew heavily emphasize the birth of Jesus. The focus of a Greco-Roman biography was how a person lived and how they died. So the focus of the Gospels, those 4 books, those biographies about Jesus' life, is the last 4 years of his life, the 3 years of his public ministry, and then his death, burial, and resurrection. So that will help us in establishing our timeline for the New Testament. The next section I want to talk about is Acts and Paul. And this is most of the New Testament timeline. There are only a few more events that happen after the end of this timeline at 70 AD. I want to talk about 3 different kinds of events on this timeline. First is events, and that's kind of big events for the whole church. Then I want to talk about the life of Paul below the timeline, and then beneath that I want to talk about the books written by Paul. So Pentecost is around 30 AD. Paul is converted about 2 years after that in 32 AD. Paul's first visit to Jerusalem is in 35 AD. He mentions that in the book of Galatians. We have the death of Herod Agrippa I in 44 AD. That's an important New Testament event for timing other things. Paul, his famine visit is in about 46 AD. That is, there's a famine going on in the Middle East at that time. Paul takes a collection and goes to visit. His first missionary journey is from 47 to 49 AD. While on that missionary journey, he travels to different places, Cyprus, Perga, Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe, and then he returns to Antioch. During that missionary journey, he writes the epistle to the churches in Galatia, the book of Galatians. The Jerusalem Council happens in 49 AD. This was a key event during the book of Acts because in it, the church leaders decided that Gentiles do not need to follow the Old Testament law. They should do certain things to not offend the Jews, but they don't have to follow the law, and that's based on the teaching of Jesus Christ. Paul's second missionary journey is from 49 to 52 AD. On this journey, he goes to Syria and Cilicia. Then from there, he goes to Galatia and Troas. He goes to Philippi, Thessalonica, Berea, Athens, and then he's in Corinth for over a year. During this second journey, he writes the epistles to the church in Thessalonica, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. Then his third journey goes from 52 to 56 AD. During this journey, he goes to Antioch, he passes through Galatia, and he goes to Ephesus. During this time period, he writes the 1st and 2nd epistle to the church in Corinth, and the epistle to the church in Rome. He spends some time in Macedonia, in Corinth, in Philippi, and he goes to Jerusalem during this missionary journey. Then we enter the time of Paul's early imprisonments. He is imprisoned in Caesarea. This is when you have the story of his shipwreck and all of that. This is about 56 to 58 AD, so about 2 years of imprisonment there. After that, he's imprisoned from 59 to 62 AD. He gets out of Caesarea, and then he's imprisoned in Rome. During his imprisonment in Rome, he writes what are called prison epistles, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon. After he's released from prison, he has a fourth journey, during which time he writes the pastoral epistles of 1st and 2nd Timothy, as well as Titus. He is rearrested in 64 to 65, and then he dies in 65 AD, around that time. That's the timeline of Paul, and that's largely the timeline of Acts, because after about the middle of Acts, it focuses mostly on Paul and his ministry. So that timeline shows you when the books written by Paul were penned. That doesn't tell you about the rest of the New Testament. So I want to look here briefly at when the rest of the New Testament was written. James is the first book of the New Testament, written before Galatians, most likely, at about 45 or 47. The Pauline epistles are written between the time of 48 to 64, that's Paul's ministry. Matthew, Mark, and Luke Acts. Luke Acts was originally written as a 2-volume work by Luke, somewhere between 50 and 70. Hebrews is written between 65 to 69, and 1st and 2nd Peter are written during that time span as well. 1st Peter at 65, 2nd Peter in 67. Jude is written sometime in the 70s. John is written between 70 and 90. 1st John is written about 85, 2nd and 3rd John around 90, and Revelation, the last book of the New Testament, around 95 to 96. So let's put all of this together. What does this look like? Well, Jesus is born in 6 BC, as we talked about before. His death, burial, and resurrection is in 30 AD. So that is Jesus' life. Then we have Pentecost, the filling with the Spirit, the baptism with the Spirit, the speaking in tongues, the preaching of Peter. That's all 30 AD. Then you have Paul's conversion a little later in 32. The Jerusalem Council is in 49. Then you have the death of Paul in 65 AD. So that time from 32 to 65 is Paul's ministry. Then you have the first book of the New Testament, James, around 46. Then you have all the books written by Paul, all of his epistles, all of his letters. Those are written during his life, obviously. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Acts are written probably during Paul's life, maybe a little bit after, depending upon the book. Then the book of Hebrews is written a little later. 1st and 2nd Peter are written around the same time as Hebrews. Jude, again, written in the 70s. John's epistles written from 70 to somewhere in the 90s. And Revelation is written in 96 AD. And that's the entirety of when the New Testament is written. So I just kind of want you to understand this concept, that about half of what we call the New Testament time period, the birth of Christ to the writing of the last book, doesn't have much new revelation. In fact, for the early years of the church, so from Pentecost up until the book of James is written, the scripture of the church is the Old Testament. And then they start writing New Testament books. The apostles and their accomplices start writing new revelation for the church. God starts teaching the church specifically with new teaching. Most of the preaching before James is coming from the Old Testament prophets preaching about how Jesus is Messiah. So I want us to get this big picture view of when the New Testament happens, how all the events fit together, how Jesus' ministry, Paul's ministry mixed together, and when the New Testament books were written. Hopefully this is a helpful overview for you.